I'm here with Dr. Angela Kauser, who is the Associate Dean of Black Church Studies and Doctor of Ministry Programs at Louisville Seminary, where she's also Associate Professor of Black Church Studies. Her publication, list of publications is considerate. I'll only mention one book. This one is titled Radicalizing Women-Centered Organizing in Power in Post-Conflict Namibia, a case study of the Shack Dwellers Federation of Namibia. This was published in 2013 and something that our listeners might be interested in checking out. Angela Kauser is also a member of the Association of Black Sociologists, the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, the American Academy of Religion, the Chicago Organizers Guild, and last but not least, the co-chair of the Institute for Christian Socialism. Thank you so much for being with me this morning, Angela. Welcome.
Thank you, Joerg. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our conversation today will be on topics of race and class. And of course, as a womanist theologian, the question of gender is always part of it as well. And so let me start by looking at sort of maybe the obvious question, beginning with that in our time today. Everybody knows that this is now July 1, 2020. The question of racism is one of the topics that's really now again, and for very good reasons, at the forefront of the American mind. It's been one of the life and death matters in the United States, really from the very beginning of the country. And so with the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, we're of course reminded of how this is an ongoing problem, and in some ways it may be getting worse. And so, Angela, my first question for you is, what are your thoughts about racism in America, and what lessons would you think the American public, and especially the church, still has to learn?
So when I talk about race, I use the term anti-Black animus because I think that's a more precise rendering of what I think has been going on from the beginning. In other words, in the founding DNA of this country, we had a sort of pro-white supremacy ethos that was coupled with anti-Black animus. So those two dynamics are always working in tension and largely against each other. And so that's number one. Number two, that the economic foundation of the United States is based in anti-Black animus in its rendering of and its expressions of capitalism. And so the economy was literally built and funded on a pattern and practice of anti-Black animus that worked itself out into chattel slavery, neo-slavery, racial segregation, murder, lynching, rape, robbery, theft. Those patterns and practices have continued into this day. And so the open air murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd are part of a 400-year history of anti-Black murder, torture, and theft of life and property by the state, largely, but also corporate interests animated by anti-Black animus. So what is different now is that, and this is only different, it doesn't, these patterns and practices will continue because they're embedded in how we have organized this society. And so to get rid of it, we have to reorganize society, and there's no political will right now to do that in its totality. There are interests around the edges, around particular issues, but not around the centering of how the whole thing is organized. Having said that, the white church in America, or white expressions of church in America largely, not exclusively, but largely have been almost entirely complicit with the capitalist project and anti-Black animus from the beginning. Number two, the white church in America has never, largely, ever repented for this sin against humanity, up to and including today. Number three, the white church is deeply implicated into these patterns and practices of racism, of anti-Black animus, and capitalism, and seems incapable and or unwilling to extricate itself in thinking in new and imaginative ways about more faithful ways of being disciples of Jesus Christ. It feels like that the white church largely is more a pattern and practice of the American civil religion and American ideologies, and not the pattern and practice of Christian discipleship, as Jesus outlined it in the Gospels.
And so I guess what that then means is really becoming aware of how it all goes together, because what I heard you say, and what I think a lot of Americans are still trying to figure out is, how is state violence connected to corporate interests, connected to what religions are saying, what religions are doing, how religions are living. And so maybe the answer then would be what I hear you suggesting, I guess, is that as we address these things, we really have to address them all together. So the church cannot just talk about whatever is the church. It has to talk about politics. It has to talk about economics and all of these things together.
That's exactly right. So if there's a cancer in the body, it seems to me that it's important to get the diagnosis right, because there's lots of different kinds of cancers. There's lots of different kinds of anti-Black animus. There's lots of different kinds of racism. In the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, there are literally thousands of different iterations of racism in the world. So the diagnosis of the disease needs to be correct. It needs to be, otherwise the treatment will not work. And we have never in this country had a full and complete diagnosis of what ails the body politic with respect to race, never. And so what that means is that our approaches to trying to, quote, fix it are inadequate, incomplete, abortive, simplistic, short-term, ignorant, and ineffective. And and the medicine may, once we have a complete diagnosis, then we can say what medicine we need in order to address and try to stop the spread of the cancer. If we don't get the diagnosis right and get the medicine right, then the cancer spreads. The cancer spreads through socialization to children and grandchildren, into how we socialize our children in families, how we socialize them in schools, how we socialize them in religious institutions, into patterns and practices of anti-Black animus. And that's true of people in America, not just whites, but how all of us are socialized into this. And so it would seem to me, Joerg, that if we had the political will to fix it, it would include a full pattern of reparations that would include at least 400 years of payments back for the work that has been done by Black and Afro and Negro Americans to build this economy. It would include a full reckoning of what it has meant educationally for the deliberate stunting of Black intellectual development through the ways in which we defund public education and continue patterns and practices of inequitable education. It would include a full accounting of the effects, the pernicious effects of redlining and how that has, fraud in how we do mortgages in stealing Black property and land. It would include a reckoning of what we have lost in never getting 40 acres and a mule in 1965, 1966, and being able to build equity and capital and wealth. So that was never provided. So we have never been able to build wealth in the same ways that whites have been able to do that. And finally, the Homestead Acts, which essentially gave millions of acres of land to immigrants and other white people in this country that enabled them to build generational wealth over the last 5, 6, 7 generations. And so we keep having, let me just stop there because I can keep
going. No, thank you so much. I mean, it's probably good to take a pause here because these are really important comments, and I really am grateful to you for putting them so clearly. As somebody who grew up in Germany, I'm a dual citizen, both of the US and of Germany. The whole question of reparations, for Germans was a very clear thing, right? After World War II, after the Holocaust, the question was not should there be reparations, to the Jewish community and people of Jewish origins, but what should they be? And so I fully agree with you that we need to talk about reparations. That's part of this theological theme of repentance that you mentioned earlier. I mean, there's no way of repenting without actually making amends, trying to fix the sort of things that were broken. And so to stay with that theme for a little bit, I mean, there's a lot more we could talk about, but we only have about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes left here. Let me put this back to you in the form of a question. If you think about the sort of things that were broken with the development of racism early on, and I think this is where class and race come together, it seems like we really have a severe distortion of labor relationships. I mean, slavery is sort of the ultimate distorted labor relationship where someone totally, absolutely, completely belongs to somebody else. Now, in a labor relation today, of course, working people don't belong necessarily to their employers, but there's still something going on. There was a recent article that argued that capitalism in the United States is so brutal because that's part of its DNA, this fractured labor relation that comes out of slavery. And while we officially got rid of slavery, some of that mentality is still around, that working people, and of course, especially working people of power, almost like as if they belong, as if they are to be controlled by the people that actually employ them. One piece of that history very early on in the United States was pointed out by Lerone Bennett, famous African-American historian, in his book Before the Mayflower. Before the Mayflower is the title of that book. And Bennett showed that, early on, this was before slavery, there were black sharecroppers and white sharecroppers working in the fields of the South. And these sharecroppers realized they had a lot in common. And so for the masters, racism became very important and an important tool in separating these workers, because once the white workers thought they were more like the white masters, they then felt, they had nothing in common with the black workers. So it split the sharecroppers, basically black and white, and it sort of made the white sharecroppers identify with the white masters because they thought, well, we have this race thing in common and we're therefore better human beings, we deserve more, and so on. And so in a way, it was an early form of divide and conquer. and racism here became very complex because it certainly worked for the white ruling class, gave some benefits to white working people, but only in a limited form. And so just wondering what some of your thoughts are about how to bring these things together. And then let's talk about reparations at the end again.
Yeah. So I think in the this is right after the Mayflower, there was something called the Bacon's Rebellion, where white and black workers, who I think were indentured, rose up and rebelled together. We also had the populist movement in the late 1800s in this country, where white and black laborers organized together to confront plantation-like conditions in the workplace and oligarchic corporate power. So there have, and then Dr. King tried to do it again at the end of his life in 1968 with the Poor People's Campaign, where he was arguing that that poor people of all races and stripes have more in common with each other than we have divergent interests. We have joint interests, but there are institutions and people for whom, in their analysis of power, it makes sense to split and to keep divided people by race in class, and that is in fact what we have today, and why it's been difficult, not impossible, but difficult to build poor people's movements across race. Having said that, I was heartened to see with the protests, the most recent protests around Black Lives Matters, more white people, at least in the streets, to protest with African Americans around police brutality. The question will be whether that translates into political gains for Black life, not its public performative piece on the street piece of it, but rather whether there's organizing behind it and a willingness to make public policy gains off of it. The final thing I'll say about it is that capitalism works in large measure around the racial hierarchy. And what that means is that for many whites, lower and working class whites, not all by any stretch of the imagination, but some, as long as they feel like they are one rung on the ladder above African Americans, psychologically they derive benefits from that. And that's been the system that's been in place from the beginning, and I don't see that differently today. There are profound exceptions to what I just said, and I really want to emphasize that, but the larger political power analysis that I have is that for many whites, psychologically, as long as they feel like they are economically, psychologically in a better place than African Americans, that they derive benefits from that.
So it's ultimately, again, connected, right? Politics, economics, and of course you could add religion into that also. I think that may be one of the issues with white religion, that it somehow feels perhaps still superior, and that has to be addressed as well.
Yeah.
One thing we've learned in Europe is that policy gains as such are great. And I mean, we've had a lot of policy gains there, right? I mean, universal healthcare is something that's taken for granted in any European country, and so on, unemployment insurance and whatnot. But we also realize that any policy gain can also be overturned and turned back again, really, if you don't have some economic power to go with it, because their economic interests that can make sure that their policy gains ultimately prevail, even though there may be some back and forth. And so if you think that back together with reparations, if you thought about, we are not just fixing policy, we're really fixing economic relationships that have been distorted for 400 years. You could see how that would actually maybe help a more profound revision of policy, religious relationships. But you also have to ask the question, you know, how is that going to happen, and how, you know, those of us who are theologians, people of faith, people who are organizing the community, how could we bring those things together? And I know you have a lot of experience in that. You've been organizing communities yourself. You're doing things now. Maybe a final comment here. Where do you think, as we work towards reparations, I think that has to be the goal. I agree fully on this. Where could we make some of these connections? Where do you see some hope here? So that will conclude our conversation for today. But this is a really important question where I believe you have some insights that would be crucial for all of us.
So I look at power and I analyze power, and reparations will happen, or at the very least, a serious discussion around reparations will happen when there has been amassed enough political power to force the issue. It will not happen in this country because it's a good idea. It will not happen because it's right. It will not happen because it's morally right. It won't even happen because of the zeitgeist, because it's quote the right time. It's been the right time for 400 years in this country to do reparations, and we've not yet managed to even have a full-blown conversation about it in this country. So hope is not an issue for me here. Hope, it's irrelevant for me. The question for me here is if and when enough political power is amassed to force the issue, then we will have it. Until that happens, we won't have it. So my issue then is to help to develop leaders in church and society who run and win political office, and to have a deep and thick enough analysis of power to figure out how to build an infrastructure of power to eventually force the conversation in reparations. That's how I see it, Joerg. I on this side of glory, power concedes nothing without a demand, and oftentimes without threat of violence. And in this case, I don't see it any differently.
Thank you so much. Those are really helpful insights for all of us. We'll keep pondering them here, of course, with the Wendland-Cook Program, and we'll have some more relations also between our schools, Louisville Seminary, Vanderbilt Divinity School, of which you are a PhD graduate. So thank you so much for your time, Angela, and I hope to continue this conversation very soon. So thank you.
It's my pleasure, Joerg. Thank you so much.